Will new voting laws passed in states across the US prevent millions from voting? And will they have an impact on who will become the next president? You're watching Inside Story, US 2012 from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Ratansi. Since the year 2000, out of 146 million registered voters, there have been just 10 cases of voter impersonation at the polls. That's according to News 21, an investigative reporting project. Yet states across the US have been considering fast-tracking laws ahead of this year's election to require voters to produce an identification card before they vote. On the face of it, this seems like a perfectly reasonable requirement. But studies have repeatedly shown that as many as 22 million registered voters might not be able to cast their ballot as a result. Most of those affected are African American, Latino, and poorer voters. The most fervent proponents of these laws are usually Republican politicians and groups. They insist they're simply ensuring that elections will be run fairly and efficiently. They're also pushing for laws that restrict early voting and voter registration campaigns. However, those who argue that states simply don't have the infrastructure to ensure every valid voter will have ID in time are having some success. Just today, a federal judge ruled that South Carolina's voter ID law cannot be implemented until after the 2012 election. The concerns remain that many voters without photo ID will still be hesitant to show up at the polls. So, with less than 1 month to the election, will the new voting laws impact the results? To discuss this, we're joined from Brussels by Tova Wang, the author of The Politics of Voter Suppression, Defending and Expanding Americans' Rights to Vote. Here in the studio, we have Nicole Austin-Hillery. She's the director and counsel of the Brennan Center for Justice, the Public Policy Institute at New York University Law School that focuses on issues involving democracy. And we also have John Fortier. He's the director of the Democracy Project at the Bipartisan Center. Let's begin by looking at some of the legislation that has been considered or passed from the Brennan Center. In fact, the Brennan Center does track these across the U.S. Since the beginning of 2011, legislation that makes voting more difficult has been introduced in 41 states. 19 states had passed 25 laws and 2 executive orders restricting voting as of the beginning of October. But citizens groups, courts, governors, and the Department of Justice have pushed back against those rules. 14 states have now blocked or repealed restrictive laws passed by state legislatures. 13 states, though, still have laws on the books that will have an impact in November. Of these, 5 are considered battleground states. Florida has passed laws restricting early voting and voter registration drives, in addition to making it more difficult for former felons to restore their voting rights once they've served their time. Virginia now requires a voter ID, although it doesn't have to include a photo. Wisconsin has restricted voter registration campaigns, but a voter ID law was blocked by the state court. Iowa has made it more difficult for former felons to vote. New Hampshire now has a voter ID law, but it can be a non-photo ID for this election only. And there's still questions as to whether the crucial swing state of Ohio will allow voting on the weekend before the election, which is traditionally when African American churches mobilize voters. Republican officials in that state are hoping that the U.S. Supreme Court will intervene to prevent that. Tova Wang, I mean, that's part of the problem, I suppose, is when you sort of go through all of that, we're sort of in danger of adding to the confusion in some ways and discouraging even more people from voting, because it's very difficult to make sense of it. As there is this push to have voter ID laws, it does give that impression, though, that you're best to assume that there probably is a voter ID law, perhaps.
Well, I actually think that is our biggest concern right now. There was such a push to pass these laws. Even before 2011, these bills were pre-filed by Republicans in state legislatures straight across the country. But now we do see that when facts and information are out there, the courts and others are seeing what the reality is of these laws and are pushing back. And I think that there has been so much discussion back and forth that there may be some confusion about this, which makes it so important to get the right information out to voters as to what the requirements are and what they're not. There are only a small handful of states at this point that are requiring a government-issued photo ID. this year, and people need to make sure that they understand that, and we need to make sure that poll workers are very well trained on this, because that is probably our biggest potential pitfall.
John Fortier, when these voter ID laws are being struck down, is it mainly because there isn't enough time or the infrastructure to get these voter IDs into the right hands, basically? I mean, it's simply not possible.
Yeah, I think we're on hold in a number of places. The courts have either postponed the putting into place of the law until after this election in 2014 or 16, or we're really awaiting a Supreme Court decision where many circuit courts and state courts have weighed in one way against some of these laws. Look, we did have two states, Georgia and Indiana, with photo ID laws in place for the last couple of elections. The court did rule in favor of the Indiana law. There's some wiggle room. Some people look to think that maybe once the evidence is out there that will change. But I think there's a reasonable chance that the court will ultimately end up affirming many of these laws, or making the states go back and tweak them to get at getting them in people's hands, or having more access to voter ID.
So is that the key then, Nicole Austin-Hillery? Then it's not necessarily that it's not necessarily a bad idea for people to have IDs rather, but it's just simply not reasonable to rush through legislation right now in the months and weeks before an election, because it's not possible.
Well, we actually at the Brennan Center don't think it's a good policy idea to ask people to show ID. We actually think that it really goes against the grain of history in this country, that we have not historically asked people to show ID. Once people have formally registered, we have always assumed in this country that is enough. Our main problem with these ID laws is that initially, but then secondarily, we say that if states are going to have this requirement, that they certainly should not make it very difficult, almost impossible for their citizens to meet those requirements. And I actually want to go back to something that you said at the beginning, right before you posed a question to Tova, and you said, shouldn't voters simply assume that they need an ID? I actually think that adds to the confusion.
Right, that was my point.
Yeah, I don't want voters to assume they need this. What I'm hoping voters will do is find out what the laws are in your particular state and ensure that you're in a position to adhere to them. Now, thankfully, because of many of these recent litigation decisions, voters are not going to have to try to jump through these confusing hoops. But, I've been in situations where secretaries of states have said, I'm in a state where we don't have these voter ID laws, but I still have citizens calling me and saying, what do I need to have with me on election day? That's all part of the confusion. So voters should not make that, necessarily make that assumption.
That there is that confusion, and that's quite worrying. But Tova Wang, what we always hear, though, I mean, what are the hurdles to getting an ID? Clearly, what those who are advocating IDs have on their side is a suggestion that, well, everyone has an ID anyway, and it's not too difficult to get one. So, I mean, what is the problem?
Right. Yeah, well, I think that there are two things happening here. I think that some of the politicians that are behind all of this is for them completely politically motivated, quite frankly. They know very well who doesn't have the kind of identification that they're trying to require in order to vote, and that those are groups like African Americans, Latinos, and also young people who tend to vote for Democrats. I think that that's very clear. I think that some other people who talk about how, or people who spout the line that, well, everyone has an ID, you need it for this, you need it for that, are really displaying a kind of ignorance about what life is like for an entire group of Americans in our country who have the same right to vote as everyone else. They don't own cars, so they don't have driver's licenses. They may even be very far from something like a DMV where they could get an identification card. They don't maybe even have bills in their own name because they are in a multiple family dwelling. With the mortgage crisis the way it's been, we have a lot of people who are engaged in these kinds of accommodations. And so really, people need to stop and think about, yes, of course, I have an ID, so what's the problem? But we need to recognize that there are many people who are in situations where they don't have the ID, and it may be very difficult for them to get, because usually you need a birth certificate in order to get an ID from the state, which a lot of people don't just have on hand. It has to match the name exactly. So if you've been married since you were born and changed your name for women, you're going to have to get a new birth certificate. All these things have costs. They involve time. They assume that you can take time off from work for hours to stand online at a Department of Motor Vehicles. And so people need to think beyond their immediate instincts about, well, I have an ID, I use an ID all the time, and think about what life is like for some other people who are just as have just as much the right to vote as anybody else.
John Fortier, I guess, that always raises that question then, even if legislators are introducing this, perhaps unaware of some of the hurdles, and they're simply doing it for the best of motivations, why is it then when presented with evidence of how difficult it's going to make such a huge section of the population to vote, they still say, well, it doesn't matter, we're going to carry on anyway? That's when you start to wonder what their motivations really are.
Well, I think in a way we have a very partial sense of what we need to do in changing our election system. Republicans generally have the view that they're worried about integrity and voter fraud or the messiness of the system.
And again, also presented with information that there is no problem with impersonating voters, at the ballot box.
Well, we have that, I think, on the other side. On the Democratic side, we tend to, when Democrats come into power, as Republicans really did in many states in 2010, when Democrats come into power, they tend to emphasize access measures, same-day voter registration or early voting.
Well, why is that a bad thing for democracy?
Well, I think we shouldn't think that one or the other is exclusive of the other. We should be able to say, let's make voting more broadly available to people, but let's make sure the right people who are eligible to vote can vote.
Right, but then there's a problem with turnout, but there isn't a problem with voter fraud.
Yeah, but John, one side is dealing with facts and evidence.
There are a number of problems in the system which I think are very legitimate. I agree that if I were passing a law to stop voter fraud, I wouldn't start with voter ID, although it is a very legitimate concern to identify the voter. And many of our states do all sorts of different things. Many of our states have very lax laws. You just come up and state your name and your address. And while that you may have an older system where everybody knew their poll worker, today that's not the case. And so I think the devil is in the details. We should try to have systems that identify the voter and do so in ways that don't discourage people from voting, but that we shouldn't ask people to identify themselves, I think is not on the table. And and broadly, I think there are a number of problems with the voting system which are on the integrity side. The number of people on the registration list who shouldn't be there, who are mistakenly on there, who are on twice by administrative reasons. Right. Questions about absentee voting, where I think there is a greater question of fraud. I would start there, but I don't think it's illegitimate to say,
look at some of those
let's
issues
look at the voter
as well.
ID.
But as we look at the motivation for this campaign to get voter ID in particular moving as quickly as possible in the weeks and months before the election, we have comments like this from Mark Turzai. He's the Republican Majority Leader in the Pennsylvania House of Representatives. He seemed pretty clear about what the voter ID law was all about.
Voter ID, which is going to allow Governor Romney to win the state of Pennsylvania. Done.
So there he was listing a number of achievements in his term. Nicole, that's the sort of thing, I suppose, that makes you wonder, well, is this really about integrity?
Yes, absolutely. And he's not the only person who's made comments like that. One of the Florida senators who introduced one of the bills in Florida on the floor, when he was giving his floor speech about why they were introducing some of these new restrictive laws, he said very specifically, we want to make this harder. We want this to be as hard as it is for people in other countries where there's not this kind of structured democracy. So when you have politicians going on record saying that, this is about winning for a certain party, or when this is about making it harder for voters, that reveals that this is really not about protecting the integrity of our democracy and the electoral system. But what I think this whole issue speaks to is something even bigger. Some of the problems that John talked about, none of us wants voter fraud. If voter fraud exists, I think we all across the board agree that we want to stamp it out. But what the real problem is here in this country is that our electoral systems are simply antiquated. We have a panoply of systems all across the country. This state does things this way, another state does it another way. What we really need is a modernized system to ensure that our voting systems work accurately and appropriately and are easy for voters. Voter registration modernization is actually a policy proposal that the Brennan Center put together, where we talk about adding things like making voting automated, ensuring that voters can register online, and ensuring that your registration follows you no matter where you move within your particular state.
Why do you think politicians aren't keen then looking at this as a national issue then, and putting some of these things?
Well, actually some politicians are looking at it as a national issue. Just in fact, during this past
as
a priority, just this past legislative session, House Democrats introduced a bill called the Voter Empowerment Act, and it, as one of its key components, has this concept concept of voter registration modernization. The Senate recently, Senator Gillibrand actually introduced a companion piece to that very bill that also includes as a core component voter registration modernization. So I think there are legislators who recognize that what we have to do is really get beyond this talk about voter ID and really figure out how do we clean up and automate our voter registration system.
In the meantime, though, there is that confusion, and I mean, there was an attempt at getting a voter ID law in Pennsylvania. It's been blocked by a judge in Pennsylvania. However, MSNBC, the network here, found many areas where, in Pennsylvania, still telling voters they need IDs to vote. And here's a bit of their investigation.
Look at Montgomery County's Department News. Pennsylvania's newly adopted voter ID law will not take effect until the November 2012 election. They also linked to this handy voter ID flyer. This is not the law. What it says here, this is not true. They are telling people to stay away from the polls when it is, in fact, legal for them to show up and vote. Pennsylvania elections officials, I respect what you do for a living. Everybody knows you are busy, but it is 32 days until the election. You have to change the information you are giving the voters so it accurately reflects the law, and you are not telling people to stay home who are legally entitled to vote. You are suppressing the vote in your state if you do that.
Now, I mean, Tova Wang, I mean, we don't know whether these are just simple oversights and so forth, but it's difficult not to, as you get more and more of these incidents,
right,
to wonder whether there is some national campaign almost. I mean, is there any evidence of that this is a coherent strategy underway?
Well, I don't think, particularly in Pennsylvania, that's likely to be the case. I think it's always safe to assume some administrative snafus are going to occur. But I will say this, it does bring up another concern. There are also organizations that have formed that are today telling people to the wrong rules around voting rights. There's an organization called True the Vote that is based in Texas and started rolling in 2010 that actually has been shown on tape to be providing training for people, some of their affiliated organizations, with total misinformation about voting and voting rights. For example, telling people that they need to show ID when they actually don't. And they claim that they're going to recruit 1 million people to go to the polls on election day and sort of, well, they say to find voter fraud, but of course we know that voter fraud doesn't necessarily happen at the polling place terribly often. And so the concern is that they're going to go out to the polls and maybe, just because they don't know the difference, tell people misinformation or maybe intentionally misinformation, or harass and intimidate them. And so that's the other concern that we're trying to talk about now so that we can sort of make sure that on election day people are actually able to vote without any interference. And so that's another issue that we want to keep on top of.
John, yes.
I was going to say, regardless of whether states are behind these efforts to misinform voters, states still have an obligation to ensure that their voters have correct information. As recently as the last few days, some members of Congress have actually sent letters to secretaries of states in some of the states where we know this kind of misinformation is being transmitted. And those members of Congress have said, we want you to do everything within your power as an election official to ensure that your voters understand exactly what the laws are, what the rules and regulations are in their state, so that they are not acting under the assumption of incorrect information.
But you don't think that there is some nation? I mean, of course, a lot of the legislation that was put through came from the American Legislative Exchange Council. We've done shows on that before, which is kind of off the peg, right-wing legislation, which some of these laws have actually basically been based on. We know that Karl Rove and super PACs and so forth are connected to the Koch brothers and are connected to groups like True the Vote, for example, and there does seem. Is there any coordination, or is that just completely anecdotal? Is that just smelling a rat, where and so forth? I mean, is it possible to draw links?
I will tell you that it looks to us as though that what we have with respect to these laws is several elected officials who are attempting to manipulate the system for their own good. Now, what the catalyst was for them doing that, I'm not certain.
John, you must get into the conversation.
Well, look, I agree with the point that we have an extremely decentralized voting system, and that causes all sorts of problems. It doesn't cause problems only on issues like voter ID. I mean, there are local officials who are not following the law on how to accept absentee ballots, either too leniently or too strictly. And so we see this all the way. And so I agree that one reform would be to somewhat less decentralized this, and at least on the concept of voter registration modernization. I think that is actually one area where, in theory, the parties can agree. There are problems with our voter registration system in big ways in both directions. 25 million people or so, names who are in the wrong places on the list improperly, right. 40, 50 million people who should be on the list. And it's not so easy to get that done overnight, but in terms of concept of cleaning up the lists and expanding them,
but
I think that's a good
help us understand them. I mean, clearly, you say, and you've done a lot of research, I think, on how there are real loopholes, perhaps, in the absentee balloting system. But what are the issues with early voting, for example, or with having registration drives to enroll more voters, or from preventing felons from voting? Why are these such big concerns when, clearly, I mean, the rolls may have difficulty, there may be some difficulties with the rolls, but why these are the issues that are being concentrated on?
Early voting, I think, has become a big issue this election. We've seen a huge rise in the number of people who vote before Election Day, either by mail or in person at polls. Up to a third of people in 2008 voted that way. One of the difficulties is I think both sides, in a way, believe the propaganda that this is a great way to encourage voter turnout. Most of the political science research has really shown that if you encourage people to vote by mail, encourage people to vote early, it doesn't actually attract more people to the polls.
There can't be any harm done, especially with in-person early voting, because of course that would stop the absentee voting.
Look, I'm in favor of a period of week to 10 days of early voting. I'd like to see it go up closer to the election, but I don't think that taking out the Sunday or taking out some hours of early voting is really going to deter voting overall. It's a good idea, I think, for many reasons, for election administrators, for convenience, but the idea that fewer people will vote because we have a few less early voting hours, which we don't have in all states and we have in some states, I think is wrong.
Tova Wang, no big deal then, this early voting business?
Yeah. Well, I mean, what the question is then, why specifically exclude the Sunday before election, which politicians know very well has become, over the past couple of election cycles, the day in which African American churches bring their congregations as a group to early voting sites to vote together, resulting in actually enormous turnout among the African Americans in states like Ohio and Florida that have cut back on these days for early voting. I mean, the coincidence has become just a little too remarkable after a while.
Yeah, and I think also that there's that interesting phenomenon then in the US, Nicole, of challenge laws. I mean, how easy it is, though, for someone's vote to be challenged in some states. There's no evidence necessarily needed for someone to stand in a polling place and call an election official over and say, I don't think this person is an eligible voter. Is that correct?
That's correct. And that is really a problem because that really leads to voter intimidation. Voters often feel as though if someone walks up to them at a polling place, they have no way of knowing, is this an official from the state, from the state? Is this an election administration official? They have no way of knowing. And a lot of voters, like most of us, we want to adhere to laws and rules and regulations. And we assume if someone looking official and sounding official comes up to us and calls something into question, most of us are going to be responsive. And for many people, that will make them nervous. That is a serious problem.
This group, True the Vote, though, I mean, they've already started putting monitors into, their monitors into polling stations before. What sort of districts are they putting their monitors in? Have we seen what sort of record they have on their independence or impartiality as they look for potential voter fraud?
You know what, Tova, you actually might know a little bit more about the districts where True the Vote folks are being stationed.
Well, I'm not sure that we know yet. I think we've heard a lot of big talk from them and not a lot of concrete action so far. They are trying to get people thrown off the registration list in some states, particularly swing states. But time will tell. But I think it's a real concern. I mean, I think we have to understand, and this is some of what I discuss in my book, that this issue of challenging is nothing new. This is an old playbook. This was going on 100 years ago in our history when Republicans were challenging immigrants in northern cities based on their ethnicity at the polling places, spiking in the 1960s with more African Americans then voting, with the RNC actually coordinating a very centralized nationwide effort to challenge people at the polling places on Election Day. Saw another spike in 2004 of this, and my concern is that we're going to see another wave of this using of election challenge laws, which are extremely weak, against voters who are perfectly eligible to be at the polls.
Can I just
now, as I said, I think that they've said a lot, but no, they've said that they're going to do a lot of things. I don't think that people should be overly concerned about it, but I think that everyone involved needs to know what is okay to do at the polling place and what is not.
John Fortier.
It's not an ideal system. Unfortunately, it's the system we have, that we don't do a very good job of government really figuring out if the lists are accurate beforehand, and we rely on both parties to watch over the list.
Is this simply bumbling government, or is this actually an election tactic?
Well, look, I worry about people being overzealous. If you're organizing many millions of people to go to the polls and say things, they're not all going to be following the law, following the script. But that's true of on almost any policy. We rely on both parties to show up at the polls and watch and challenge people. We don't have a system where we have a lot of really official government people with a good system in advance, and we rely on both parties kind of watching each other, and that has some problems. So again, I think checking out the voter registration list early in advance would be better, but given the system we have now, we do have to allow some sort of challenge to these
all right, we're going to leave it there. John Fortier, thank you. Tova Wang, thank you. Nicole Austin-Hillery, thank you as well. And that's it from the team in Washington, D.C. for now.